We are going to move to Vice Chancellor Troy, item 5.3, update of the 2012-13 system budget request.
5.4.
Good morning. I'm sure you're probably all tired of talking about the 11-12 budget, so for a little variety, we'll move on to 12-13. So I think there's a couple of key issues in regard to this item. The first is I'll provide a review of what the budget work group has done to this date, and I think probably more importantly to get some feedback from the board on what you think the priorities for the budget system request should be are. So hopefully have a just good discussion about that. So as you probably know, we are required to provide our budget system request to the Department of Finance in September. With that in mind, we did pull together a budget work group in June to discuss priorities for the system. There was broad consensus within the group to focus on the big three, as we call it. It's categorical restoration, COLA restoration. We haven't had a COLA in about 4 years now. And the third major priority would be growth funding or restoration. That's similar to the request we put forward for the 11-12 year. In addition to that, the group did pull out a few specific other new requests, if you will. One is to equalize the funding for the career development and college prep non-credit courses. Right now they're funded at about $3,200 per FTS, and the full credit funding would be up to about $4,500, and that was the intent of SB 361, and we haven't been able to equalize that yet. Equalizing that would cost, we estimated, about $30 million, so that was one request that was put forward. Another request came from Academic Affairs, which is, I believe, was a recommendation in the report they presented to you at an earlier meeting on distance education. The retention rates in distance ed are lagging behind those of classroom instruction. So what Academic Affairs is proposing is to put out some grants to districts so they can study things that can improve the retention rates for those courses. They had suggested doing $5 million a year over for each of 5 years, so a total of $25 million to have districts
Excuse me one
issue.
second, Dan, just so we're clear. These things that you are describing here, such as studying how to improve retention, this is a request for additional and or new dollars from the state as opposed to rearranging what we have.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Similar to a request we put in this year, we also it was also suggested that we request funding to fund the Student Senate. That'll be about $200,000, and there'd be we do fund the Academic Senate, so it seems to be that's a conforming request. It was also suggested by the group that we put aside some dollars for the Student Success Task Force proposals. I'm not sure the timing of that is going to work out very well, given that the task force requests are going to come out later this year. But there was some thought among the group that we should be emphasizing the work of that task force and our focus on educational quality is not just access. There were some ideas without any specific proposals to maybe come up with some proposals for to focus on the unemployed who are trying to return to the workforce and retool their skills, and also on returning veterans. Again, we did not get a specific actionable request on that, but there was concern expressed that we should be should be considered addressing those needs in the system. It was also, I think with some wisdom, thought that we should put out some ideas for one-time funding. If there's last-minute Proposition 98 settle-up funding, for example, we probably want some items out there for us to spend on one-time needs, such as paying back prior mandate claims or issues along those lines, and I think that's a good idea as well. So I think some of the questions for the board then that you may want to consider is, do you think the priorities that the work group has laid out so far seem about right? Is this a good year to be requesting new programs, given that we're likely going to face another fairly tough budget this year? So with that, I'd ask for your input.
Vice President Perez and then Member McDougal.
Thank you for that brief report. It would be really helpful if you can summarize that for us. There was a lot of information that you just laid out, and I think in order for us to react to that, it would be really helpful if we had a summary of the items that you're thinking about. I would really question us asking for an increase in funding when it doesn't look like that is likely to happen. I think it's more appropriate that we look at the current funding we have and how do we manage within that budget. And if there's an opportunity to move things around, what does that look like? And then the other question I had is when you talk about supporting student success, are there specific areas of student success that we're looking at from a funding perspective to support?
Well, I do think the agenda item does detail the issues that were discussed in the work group. So I'm sorry if that item was not clear enough for you. I think the one item that we neglected to include in the write-up was the request for the Student Senate funding.
You're talking about the item in 5.3?
Yeah.
Okay, I read that it seemed like there was more that was mentioned. Perhaps I just thought there was more that you were talking about than was listed here.
Yeah, I think the only item that was not mentioned was the Student Senate request. Anyway, in regard to your, I think, larger point, it's certainly the case that, I believe in total we asked for over $900 million in 11-12, and we lost $400 million in the budget. So there's certainly some truth to the fact that we're not going to get everything we ask for. But it probably is beneficial to make a significant request. If we don't document our needs, if we don't ask for things, I think there will be a growing sense that, well, we don't think it's necessary. I think we need to be able to say, hey, we've got 4 or 5 years of foregone COLA here. That's a loss of purchasing power at this point, probably over $800 million. And I do think we want to have a document where we lay out those hits that the system has taken and how we do need those those dollars to support students. So there is some benefit, I think, to making a request, even though we know that the full request won't be granted. Having said that, I think we do also want to show that we're being efficient, and if we're going to make proposals for new programs, things other than COLA, et cetera, showing a willingness to move some money around may be a wise approach.
So on the student success, were there specific items that we're looking to fund with that?
No, there was no specific proposal there. I think the group just wanted to show support for the work of the task force, but again, I'm not sure the timing of that is going to work out for the budget request, because the task force is not going to make its presentation to the board. I think they're not scheduled until January, as I recall correctly.
And if I could just add on that, it's actually at the meeting, the task force meeting this week, is when we're anticipating that the first draft of the plan will start coming together, and so in a lot of ways, Dan's group is waiting to hear from the task force. I think we'll have some actionable items prior to January. I think we'll probably have some initial items we can move forward on, but I think he probably has a fair point in terms of the larger investments. They very likely won't be as part of this request, but maybe for the next request. And if I could just add on to Dan's point about the need to put something on the table in terms of asking for resources. I think most people who are watching the state budget and are looking at Prop 98 are expecting a net increase in Proposition 98 for the next year. And so I definitely concur with Dan's position. We need to stake out what our priorities are. The administration's already made clear that one of their first priorities is going to be paying off deferrals, which, fiscally may be a prudent thing to do. But if you go down that path, that's the next $961 million in funding to the colleges. Just pays off deferrals, doesn't pay for any growth, any COLA. We could be doing that for 10 years. And that doesn't really lead to a net plus to how much money the colleges have to spend, because they just use borrowing their trans in order to access that funding ahead of the time. So I definitely concur with Dan's point. I think it's critical that we get our priorities on the table. Otherwise, somebody else is going to set those.
Yes, we absolutely have to make the case for educational quality and access, and asking for growth and COLA restoration, I think, is a very key request, even if we're not likely to get the full amount that we request.
I would just like to suggest from the student success perspective, what we continue to hear that is a barrier for our students is that we don't have enough counseling services, we don't have enough basic skills services, and with some of the actions that the board's taken recently, that's what we continue to hear is lacking as far as part of the problem. So, I mean, I would just like to see some very specific funding requests in those categories if that's what we're deeming student success.
Thank you.
Member McDougall?
Two comments on the proposal and then a question. Comments, first of all, I as a board member, support the three priority items, not necessarily in that order, but fully support them. Second comment is that I think the request to be made whole on all three of those areas is absolutely critical. And I think we have a very, very strong basis for advocating that position and advocating it strongly in terms of the demand for what the community colleges provide and our inability to meet that demand. So those are my two comments in terms of feedback on the proposal that you've made. My question has to do with the funding total. I think you made reference to that, and I'm not sure I understand it. But I would like to have a translation of the dollar amounts that would be required to make us whole in the three categories. I think you just mentioned that there was $800 million that would be required to respond to I think meet COLA or growth. I'm not sure what it was. But if we were made whole on those three categories, what is the amount of funding that would be required?
Yeah, I think I could give you at least a decent estimate of that right now. I think to be made whole on growth, again, just to make up for the cuts we've had over the last 2 or 3 budget cycles, would be about $360 million. So that's not new growth, that's just restoration of the cuts. To make up for the foregone COLAs over the past few years, and this is not an exact figure, but I would ballpark it at about $830 million. And what we did in the 11-12 request is we documented at that time the COLA figure was $660 million, and we asked for half of that this year. So we could take a similar approach. We could say the total numbers $800 million, and maybe we request a third of it over 3 years or something like that. We can.
Now, what about the you left out one of the categories?
Oh, the categorical funding,
Yeah.
$313 million.
313. So we're talking about somewhere around 1.4 billion that the system would be requiring. And I just feel very strongly as a member of the board that our position should be full funding in those areas, recognizing that, of course, compromise will be essential. But our responsibility is to make the case for our service to the state. And we have tremendous legitimacy in making the case at that base level from my perspective, and would urge that that's what we do.
Member Ramos?
I want to talk about this distance education projection on $25 million and requests for research. It seems to me like that is, well, first, I'd like to know a little bit about what the logic is of that scale of request. And I want to learn a little bit more about the protocol that we have in mind. I think, if I understand correctly, Vice Chancellor Troy, you were talking about grants that would be made to different segments of the system to do individuated research on certain related topics. And I just wonder if there would be economies in a singular assessment. I just think that number seems high in light of comments by Vice Chancellor or Vice President Perez of the funding environment. It just seems like there would need to be more substantiation of what the case is for this additional funding. So if you could help us think that through, that would be instructive.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think you could make that the request from Academic Affairs at the $25 million level, I think you could certainly argue that maybe $1 million a year would be fine. I don't know how much, how large that number needs to be in order to get a good study. I think you could probably do a grant for $1 million a year, say, give that out to 2 or 3 colleges and have them report on the results, different approaches they take, and we can see if they were able to improve retention. I think that's certainly an area that if we wanted to go forward with that request, we could do that at any number of different levels.
I think we should think that through more specifically, just so that if and when that goes forward, we have something to substantiate with respect to our case to the legislature.
Yeah, absolutely.
Member McDougall?
My assumption would be that if the board does adopt the priorities that we established last year, that given Vice Chancellor Troy's estimate of the amount, i.e. $1.5 billion, that the proposals that we have after that are basically pie in the sky. You know, it's great to have them. They recognize needs. But what we're saying is, make us whole, enable us to build back the counseling. The categorical programs have been so important to us. Those represent the top priorities for our system. Once those are met, then fine, we need non-credit funding equalization. We need to look at distance education. We need to do some of the other things that represent progress for the system. But progress has to follow basic funding to enable us to do the fundamental job of providing access and educational programs for our students.
I have a comment, but I'll defer to any other board members first, seeing none. A couple things in response, Member McDougall and Vice Chancellor, and I'll ask Chancellor Scott this as well. Having been in the system up here for a few years and very close to the workings of the budget, along with the Chancellor, and I'll ask you to comment. While I agree with what you're saying, make us whole, part of this, unfortunately, is a political calculation in how you present that. So, I mean, I think we have to ask the question with the people who are going to be in the meetings with the Senate and the legislature and the governor's office. Is that the appropriate way to go? Or, as I heard before, do we present it in a way that says we're going to, we'd like to get a third now and over time, however the Chancellor's office might think that might be presented. The second item that I would request also, Vice Chancellor Troy, is when you put together your work group, and I don't know if it was all internal or you had some consultation council or...
Yes, it consisted of some obviously Chancellor staff and consultation council members. And
I would request that we would have a member or two of the board on that as well. I know Vice Chancellor Skinner would, last year anyway, the year before, would call Member Baum and I during this process. So I think it'd be very, very helpful to have a couple representatives of the board, either by telephone or in person, as a part of this group. I think we could feel a little more informed in advance. Chancellor Scott.
Well, there are, and I think this is a very difficult thing to figure out. I do think you always have to ask for more, because if you come to the table and you say, well, we can live with what we've got, the legislature and the governor are more than willing to accept that estimate. I mean, that would be a relief to them, and I can guarantee you that the University of California and CSU are going to be at the table making some very large requests. So we've got, but on the other hand, we can't get into fantastical kinds of, we need $10 billion or something, And clearly, eyes glaze over and we don't get much of anything. I do think the three things that you've mentioned are the most important. I would say the legislature and some others may look at growth particularly because they are hearing from their constituents about how many people are trying to get into our classes and can't get in. And they're feeling some guilt about that, frankly. And that's fine. I don't mind creating a little guilt along that line. Even the argument over AB 515 was a sign that the community colleges were getting desperate in trying to serve the needs of a public out there that are demanding our classes, and we can't fill the need. So, and I think we can make a case for COLA. People, after all, inflation does occur, and we've gone 4 years without a COLA, and, the utilities go up, liability insurance goes up, all those things that are involved. So that's a good case. And the restoration of the categorical programs, particularly if we emphasize the fact that this will allow us to provide the student services that are so desperately needed by the kind of students that we have. And Vice President Perez mentioned that. Probably when we get beyond that, even though there are groups within the community colleges that like to speak up and say we need this, we need that, and of course, let me just be blunt here, like equalization of non-credit funding, I don't think that's going to ring too much with the legislature. That's something that colleges that have a large non-credit program naturally want, but that's not going to be very high on the list of things that the legislature is going to respond to. They don't respond, or most politicians don't respond a lot to paying more for programs we already have. Some way or another, we've got to suggest that we're going to do more because, there's a caveat back there that says, well, if they're getting along and doing it, I don't know that I want to pay more for it. So those are the kind of requests. But the categoricals, even though we say restoration of categoricals, when we say we've got these students that we're trying to help succeed, and these students are falling by the wayside, then I think we can make a case. So I like the three emphases. I probably would suggest that the other things that if they're mentioned at all in our request, they ought to be pretty far down the line because it's not too likely that we're going to get that funded. Now, the Student Success Task Force, when we come up with our recommendations, we may get some of those funded because we're saying we're going to make students more successful. In other words, we're going to, we've got some programs here that we think can improve the percentage of students who get their degrees, the percentage of students who get their certificates. And so we're going to spend your money. If you spend money here, we're going to be more effective. And you're going to hear later from Vice Chancellor Perry. We're already making some progress, by the way, on success and some other things in the colleges. So I think we can build on all of this. I think we can make a solid request, and we will, and making a solid request, we will in turn not get it all. I realize that, but we will highlight the fact that we're there wanting to serve more people. We're wanting to get more individuals with those career technical certificates. We're wanting to get more people ready to transfer. President Obama and a lot of other people are saying we're going to need more college graduates. Right. And a lot of them are saying that the key to that is to get more people in community colleges and for the community colleges to be more successful at transfer. And so we are at least sort of striking when the iron is hot in a sense of that request. Now, I think the input of the board is important, and we will, I'm sure that Vice Chancellor Tory can bring that about.
Okay, appreciate that. Member McDougal.
Yeah, just a final comment. I concur with everything the Chancellor has said, and just want to ensure you, President Himmelstein, that I'm not naive as to the process. But I think our fundamental responsibility as the board is to present a budget that represents the fundamental needs of the system. And then, as the process proceeds, being politically astute as to what is possible to obtain. So I think we start with A, and where we finish is another matter, and that depends on the process.
Point taken. Okay. Vice Chancellor Michalowski, I'm not sure what this note says. Can we have a 1 minute for a slide conference?
It's not secret.
Oh.
I just was letting you know the students need to leave at 9:40 to catch a train. So if Eric could be allowed to speak to this item,
Okay,
that would be
okay,
appreciated.
okay. Go ahead.
Kevin Feliciano, Student Senate for California Community Colleges.
Good morning, members of the board. Thank you for letting me speak again, and thank you for bumping me up a little bit. Thank you, first of all, to the Budget Task Force for including the Student Senate in the system budget request for next year. The new leadership is dedicated and committed to fulfilling our core mission. What this funding means to the Student Senate is simple. It means that the student's voice is represented in the shared governance process statewide, which is now more important than ever with this budget crisis that we have. However, with increased funding comes increased responsibility and accountability on the part of the Student Senate, which includes our accountability to you guys, the Board of Governors. We are committed to doing just that. We are looking into improving our processes and our policies on how exactly we are accountable to not only our constituencies, but to our system partners and to you as a whole. We'd like to thank you for your consideration of the Student Senate in this budget item. And on a personal note, since I have to leave, you guys haven't gotten to the ceremonial items part yet, but the Student Senate would like to thank past President Malumed and past President Pater for their service to the students. Thank you.
Rachel Richards, past Treasurer, Student Senate.
Good morning, President Himmelstein, Chancellor Scott, and members of the board. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak on this item. When dealing with the Student Senate finances and asking for donations, it takes time away from the core mission of the organization. The passage of the standing orders, item 3.1, will certainly cause the local colleges to improve participation and lead to an increase in the donations that they provide from the local colleges and regions, as well as from our system partners, our advocacy groups, and businesses. However, I have provided recommendations to the new president to evaluate how well they are participating in shared governance at the constituents' request. My current analysis shows an overwhelming, disproportionate lean in the last 2 years of bureaucratic items in quest to return this organization into the former CalSAC. The new council needs to improve and evaluate what and how they are participating. The new president and I have consulted. He has assured me that the organization is committed to ensuring the integrity of their organization and being accountable to their constituents and the shared governance process. I even have it signed. However, they will need your assistance. Currently, they are in a serious deficit and do not have the funding for more than 5 meetings for the year. They do not have the money for advocacy events such as SFAC participation or the March in March. The money for quality shared governance participation must come from the system budget. The projection of what I've analyzed on what they need due to the restructure of the regions having 3 senators now, they need a minimum of $88,000 to participate effectively with quality. The advocacy money must come from the local constituents, from businesses, from regions, and the student representation fees and advocacy groups. They need a minimum of $20,000 in order to advocate effectively, such as the March FAC and training and leadership training. I thank you for the opportunity to address you on this item. I believe that the new Senate will progress to doing what they are purposed to do. I've done an extensive evaluation in numbers. If any of these board members, any of you are interested in seeing the evaluations, the numbers and research that I've done, I'll be more than happy to provide that to you. As you know, I do better work writing and citing information and research than I do in speaking. So if you have questions, I'll be more than happy to take those from you as well, if you like.
We have a couple of speakers who would like to comment on our state and federal legislative update. We're going to move that report till tomorrow in the interest of time, in that we have an event at 5:30. I'd like to get through our budget update and our system budget request, but I would like to make sure that our speakers have the opportunity to appear before us. So I'd like to call them now to make sure they get their time. Our first speaker is Paula McCraskey with the California Association of Post-Secondary Education and Disability.
Mr. President,
Yes.
members of the board, Chancellor Scott, I'm really happy to be here today representing KPED, but I also want you to know that I'm a parent of 2 graduates of California community colleges, one of whom has a disability, both of whom transferred and graduated from universities. And KPED wants to applaud the board for having endorsed restoration of categorical funding. I know that in this budgetary time, it's a very difficult thing, and it won't happen overnight. But there's some things that KPED thinks that that we'd be remiss in not reminding you of concerning DSPS as it compares to other categorically funded programs, which are all needed and all help student success for underrepresented students. But in DSPS, we are responsible for ensuring the civil rights of individuals with disabilities, the civil right of access and accommodation. In fact, I think it's really important to note that these civil rights and non-discrimination laws, the ADA, Section 504 of the Rehab Act, are laws that require public entities to provide any aid, benefit, or service. If they do it for anyone, they have to do it for everyone, and they can't do it to a lesser degree for individuals who have disabilities. They have to allow them to participate at the same level that anyone without a disability would participate. DSPS can't choose how many students it's going to serve. We can't say we are going to only serve 10% or 15 or 20% of the population at the school. If the college accepts the student, we are then obligated to provide those accommodations as appropriate to the student with an eligible disability and documented. You know, what are we going to say? We are going to provide you an interpreter, but we're not going to provide you an interpreter because you came here a day later. We can't do that. We're only requesting that you consider the reductions across the board as being more equitable. If my numbers are correct, then the system as a whole took approximately a 9% cut since the 2008-2009 budget. Well, categorical programs in DSPS in particular took a 40% cut. That just, has it been 3 minutes already? I'd like to request an accommodation for my cultural difference of being from the South and talking a little more slowly.
Well, I hear you, and I'll give you about 15 more seconds.
Oh, my goodness, I don't even think I can talk that fast. I do want to let you know that you're doing this at a time when our numbers are expanding dramatically, and including veterans coming back with PTSD, with post-traumatic stress, with traumatic brain injury, with adult onset hearing loss. What are we going to say to them? So we just want you to look at disabilities and do this on an equitable level. I want to point
Thank
out
you.
one thing, please, another second.
McCluskey, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, we can't. If I allow it for you, I have to allow it for others. So you'll need, thank you for your testimony.
Okay, thank you.
Brandon Tartaglia, Disability Rights, California.
Hello, my name is Brandon Tartaglia. I'm with Disability Rights California. We're a nonprofit advocacy agency that advocates for the legal and human rights of people with disabilities. The disabled student programs and services have been cut drastically in the past few years, as have the community colleges, but the disabled student services have been cut to a degree about 4 times more proportionately than the overall community colleges. The cuts have been disproportionate and discriminatory, and they have a much harsher impact on the people who need them. You see, these services aren't just ancillary feel-good services. These services help schools meet federal and state ADA requirements and are of the utmost importance to people with disabilities, and they should be of the highest priority to you when deciding your budget requests. These services are vital for people with disabilities to complete their education and to be contributing members of society. They prepare people with disabilities for 4-year schools and job training, which allows them to enter the workforce, keeps them off of welfare programs, and saves the state money in the long run. Not to mention that it's the right thing to do. We urge you to make sure that the DSPS services are funded in a manner of equity that affords people with disabilities the same opportunities as their non-disabled peers. Students with disabilities perform at about the same level as do their non-disabled peers. Should retain the persistence and retention and success, but they do so as a result of having received accommodations. Did you know that they do this through accommodations? They need to continue to have these accommodations to succeed at the same levels as the students as other non-disabled students. So we should make sure that these are not cut disproportionately and that these services are provided in an equitable manner. So I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me, and please consider that when making your budget requests. Thank you.
Thank you. And I apologize. I guess I actually misread this number here. This was for item 5.3 instead of 5.4. So nonetheless, you did get an opportunity to testify with